Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I would like to thank Jeannie Berry, sitting in the back, Chief of Interpretation at the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site, for inviting me to do this. And I'd also like to thank Emily Watson, who is a ranger out there who helped prepare the PowerPoint presentation from photos I had given them before I retired and no longer had. So this presentation is going to be a little bit different. As I prepared it, it seemed like it was going to end up being a little bit more like an oral history. But to keep it in the 45 minutes, I really had to write it down to get done what I needed to do. And I also found out that my cataracts are not bad enough for surgery, but make it difficult to read, so you'll have to bear with me. So let's begin. While growing up as a young boy in Rapid City, South Dakota, I vividly remember laying in bed on hot summer nights with the windows wide open, waiting to go to sleep, only to have the silence broken by the distant rumble of B-52 bombers, beginning their takeoff roll, one right after the other, at Ellsworth Air Force Base, located 10 miles to the northeast. As the rumble increased in intensity and then gradually disappeared into the distance, I laid awake wondering whether or not the planes would ever return, whether it was another practice mission or whether it was a real thing, and if within minutes I would see the fireballs of Soviet nuclear weapons detonating over western South Dakota. Some of you may share those memories of running home from school when the warning siren sounded, of a friend or neighbor installing a bomb shelter in their backyard, of the yellow and black public fallout shelter signs posted on schools, banks, churches, and office buildings. Who can forget the pictures of Soviet missile-laden ships steaming toward Cuba, or the television newsreels of U.S. jets scrambling from their bases, darkening the air with trails of black kerosene soot during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was at that moment in 1962, the most dangerous of the Cold War, that the Minuteman Intercontinental Ballistic Missile was first deployed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. Shortly thereafter, President Kennedy referred to it as his ace in the hole, a motto the 10th Missile Squadron at Malmstrom has kept to this day. At that time, construction of the missile field at Ellsworth was well underway, and a year later, the 165 sites at Ellsworth were completed, and the nation's second Minuteman wing was declared combat ready. By 1967, a total of 1,000 Minuteman missiles had been deployed in hardened underground silos across the upper Midwest. The Minuteman was one of the most significant weapons in U.S. history. With the turn of the key, the missile could deliver its nuclear weapon to a Soviet target in 30 minutes or less. It was a weapon for which there was virtually no defense, for a war no one would win. It was with those words that I began my 1998 congressional testimony in support of the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site Establishment Act. I don't recall that those childhood images and memories ever had a real influence during my school years. And never in the following years did I ever entertain the idea of a career in the Air Force. I ended up as a plumber, a welder, and a job superintendent. It would never occur to me that a plumber would end up testifying before Congress. The events leading up to the development of Minuteman could be traced back to the end of World War II. To counter the threat of Soviet expansion and world domination that began following World War II, the United States adopted a policy of deterring Soviet aggression by the threat of massive retaliation with nuclear weapons. The arms race had begun. When the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb in 1953, many believed they had the capability to deliver it with an intercontinental ballistic missile, and that the United States had fallen behind in the arms race. Then in 1967, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Within months, talk of a significant missile gap added to America's growing sense of insecurity. In February 1958, the Air Force authorized the production of a new missile called Minuteman. The new missile would be stored vertically in its long position in underground facilities, would be self-supporting, would require minimum maintenance, and have a quick launch reaction. It would be America's first turnkey missile. Work on Ellsworth Missile Facility closely followed behind Malmstrom Air Force Base. Due to the national sense of emergency, men worked 7 days a week, 3 shifts a day, constructing 150 launch facilities and 15 launch control facilities located in western South Dakota. The deployment area stretched 130 miles west to east from the Wyoming line to Belvedere, South Dakota, and 100 miles north to south from the Badlands to Faith, South Dakota. Slightly over 2 years after the work began, the nation's second Minuteman missile wing was completely loaded and ready for combat. But Minuteman was not the only missile of the 44th Missile Wing. First, there was the Titan I, designed as an improvement and backup to the Atlas ICBM. The Titans became operational in September '62, but were retired a little over 2 years later in favor of the newer and improved Titan II and Minuteman ICBMs. The Titans were configured in a 3x3 configuration, 3 missiles at each of 3 missile complexes. The 3 complexes were located near Wicksville, Hermosa, and Sturgis, South Dakota. The Titan I was a 2-stage liquid-fueled rocket utilizing a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen. They were stored in underground silos, but they had to be raised up on an elevator to ground level before fueling and being launched. It was huge. It was 98 feet long, 220,000 pounds, and carried a single 8 megaton, 8,000-pound warhead. In contrast, the Minuteman was quite small. It was only 56 feet long, weighed 65,000 pounds, and carried a single 1 megaton warhead. The Minuteman was a 3-stage solid propellant missile that could be launched within minutes of receiving an authorization from the President of the United States. The missiles were deployed in unmanned, remotely located launch facilities, 1 missile per site, in silos hardened to resist the effects of a nuclear blast. The LFs were located 3 to 5 miles apart to increase their survivability. The 1,000 Minuteman missiles were deployed at 6 bases in the Midwest of the United States. There was Grand Forks and Minot in North Dakota, Great Falls, Montana, Ellsworth, F.E. Warren in Wyoming, and Whiteman in Missouri. The Ellsworth missiles system consisted of 150 launch facilities and 15 launch control facilities. They were grouped into flights of 10 missiles and 1 launch control facility. The 5 flights were then grouped together in squadrons of 50 missiles. The LCFs consisted of 2 main above-ground structures. There was the garage and then the support building, which housed the dormitories, the day room, the kitchen, and so forth. Below grade, 32 feet at Delta 1, was the launch control capsule, where the missile combat crews stood alert 24 hours a day. There were normally 10 personnel on site, 2 combat crew members down in the capsule, and topside, there was a facility manager, a cook, and a day and a night shift of 3 security forces consisting of a flight security controller and a 2-man alarm response team. Here's a very old picture of Delta One LCC, or LCF. Here we see Delta One from the interstate. Nothing that really indicates a military facility. And up close, Delta One. 32 feet below ground is the launcher, or the blast door to the launch control capsule. And you can see that the capsule crews weren't always pushing buttons, but they did have some time on their hands. Here was the launch control capsule where they were able to monitor their missiles and launch them had the command been given. There was art throughout the missile fields, and the DoD Legacy Program funded the archival photography of those photographs at all 100 launch control facilities at the 6 missile bases. And here's a few of those pictures. The launch facilities consisted of about 1.6 acres of land surrounded by a security fence. There were 3 underground structures. There was the support building that housed the electrical and generator support equipment. There was the UHF antenna, and then there was the launcher with this 80-foot deep, 12-foot diameter silo that housed the 58-foot long, 72,000-pound missile. It was covered by a 90-ton launcher closure door that would be blown clear in the event of a launch. Here is Delta 9 from the interstate. From a distance, there was really not too much visible. And this is an old aerial photograph of a typical LF. They were always oriented with the launcher at the south end, but the roads could come in from any one of the 4 directions. And here's a picture of the launcher. You can see the 90-ton launcher closure door and then the rails on which it would roll open. So there I was in 1984, after earning an engineering degree, enjoying a 10-year career with a local construction firm I had no intention of leaving. I found myself, at the urging of a friend, applying for an opening at Ellsworth Air Force Base. In late 1984, I began to work as a missile engineer in support of the 150 nuclear missiles remotely deployed across that 13,500 square miles of western South Dakota. I quickly embraced the Strategic Air Command culture and found a great sense of purpose in the ICBM mission. I took on new challenges, resolved problems, managed projects, and designed upgrades, some of which were applied SAC-wide. Nuclear deterrence was a serious business. The U.S. nuclear triad consisted of manned nuclear bombers, nuclear missile submarines, and land-based ICBMs. The Ellsworth ICBMs regularly maintained a 99% or greater alert rate. I remember getting a call in the middle of the night. The rural electric power had gone down at the missile site. The backup power generator failed to start, and the site was running on its emergency batteries, which would only last so long. A maintenance team had been dispatched to the site to get the generator running before the site dropped off nuclear alert. One of my contracts at the time was to install new doors and high security locks on the support buildings. The maintenance team was unable to open the new door. Realizing that arranging for a civil engineering craftsman to respond in the middle of the night would take too much time, I called one of my missile engineering inspectors and gathered up a bunch of tools and headed for Ellsworth. All the way out to the site, I was formulating Plan A and Plan B to break into the site. Fortunately, Plan A, which involved crawling through ductwork, just like in the movies, worked perfectly. But for those of you wondering, the missile and the launch critical equipment was still very securely locked under the 90-ton door in the 80-foot deep silo that was adjacent to that support building. Then in 1991, in 1991, seemingly almost overnight, the mission ended. For nearly 3 decades, the Ellsworth 44 Missile Wing had stood alert. The Berlin Wall had fallen 2 years earlier, in 1989. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as START, had been signed by President Bush and Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev in July of 91. So on September 27th, 1991, President Bush addressed the nation on television and announced a series of dramatic actions to lower nuclear tensions. His plan for peace required the withdrawal from alert within 72 hours of all 450 Minuteman II ICBMs. The next day, maintenance, security police, and operations personnel began working round the clock to dissipate launch codes and install safety control switches at the 150 LFs. The signing of the START Treaty concluded 10 years of negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was the first arms control treaty to significantly reduce the deployed strategic nuclear forces of the two countries. While the treaty required the elimination of the missile silos, meaning destruction, it also allowed for a limited conversion to static displays. Deactivation began officially on the 3rd of December, 1991, when the first of Ellsworth 150 missiles was removed from Gulf 2 near Red Owl, South Dakota. After classified items, save list items, and items of environmental concerns were removed, the site was placed into its caretaker status pending contract dismantlement or demolition. Early in the deactivation process, the National Park Service and the Air Force began discussions on the preservation of 2 Minuteman facilities as nationally significant Cold War historic sites. For years, countless travelers had driven I-90 across western South Dakota en route to Mount Rushmore National Memorial or Yellowstone National Park, not realizing that they had passed within sight of nearly a dozen nuclear missile sites that had so impacted their way of life. 2 of those sites, Delta 1 Launch Control Facility and Delta 9 Launch Facility, were selected for preservation. I remember Air Force working group meetings where we developed revised deactivation procedures to leave those 2 sites looking almost exactly as they were when they were operational. I fondly recall an early meeting with National Park Service planners where we enthusiastically discussed ideas of interpreting the new sites, noting the irony of a weapon of mass destruction surrounded by the peaceful prairie. So while preservation plans moved forward, so did deactivation. On the 4th of July, 1994, the 44th Missile Wing was inactivated, a victim of its own success. The war had been won. Remnants of the Missile Wing disappeared almost overnight. Within days, the 44th Missile Wing was painted over on the Pride hangar, and the full-size Minuteman missile standing in front of it had been cut down. I had become the Minuteman II deactivation program manager. left not only to oversee the demolition of the missiles in accordance with START, but with the keys to Delta 1 and Delta 9, an old ammunition bunker full of missile site equipment, and the unspoken charge to continue preservation of the two missile sites. Oh. Okay. Contract dismantlement of the sites managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began in the spring of 1994, just before the inactivation of the missile wing. Opening of the launcher closures indicated the formal beginning of the START silo elimination for each individual site. The contractor then began removing additional environmental items, salvaging a launch equipment room cabling, salvaging the electronic racks, and cutting out the steel portions of the launch tube. They then demolished the support building with mechanical breakers. They dug a big hole for the 90-ton launch door and pushed it in. The contract called for its demolition, but they found that the dynamite would just blow through and would not break it apart, so they ended up just having to bury it. They then drilled 70-plus holes in the launcher headworks to a depth of over 25 feet and loaded it with 750 pounds of ammonium nitrate. Often, the surrounding landowner got to push the button. Following each blast, the concrete and the rebar were separated, and the rebar was placed in a pile for salvage. Over 140 tons of structural steel was salvaged from each site. The concrete rubble was then dumped down the silo and covered with earth. An observation cone, approximately 20 foot deep and 70 foot wide, was excavated over the remaining portion of the silo. All of the work was then stopped for a formal 90-day observation period, which allowed the Soviet states to verify the silo elimination with their satellites. Later, the contractor returned to backfill and restore the site. The complete site consisted of a graded gravel pad surrounded by the original security fence. The last site was completed in November 1997. At the height of the Cold War, in the early 60s, the Ellsworth missile sites were constructed in a little over 2 years. In contrast, the deactivation and dismantlement of those same sites took 6 years. Over the next few years, progress on Delta 1 and Delta 9 seemed sometimes slow but steady. The Air Force and National Park Service cooperative efforts included an historic American engineering record, a National Historic Landmark nomination passage, a special resource study, and oral history interviews, along with an interim management plan to provide continuing day-to-day maintenance and long-term preservation and protection of the sites. Possibly my favorite memory was working with Sarah Hutchison, a National Park Service historical architect, on the conversion of Delta 9 to a static display. We traveled to Green Valley, Arizona, to view the Titan II site that had become a museum. We sat in his Denver office, mocking up the heights of the viewing glass and safety railings on the wall we were to build. The final design incorporated hidden features that permanently secured the 90-ton launcher closure door 1 foot past halfway open, but allowed the visitors to stand over the top of the silo and peer down the 80-foot deep launch tube at what appeared to be a 70,000-pound nuclear-tipped ICBM still on alert. The Delta 9 static display plans were complete in the summer of 1996. However, they just sat on the shelf waiting for the enabling legislation as the Air Force continued to blow up missile sites, one right after the other. Then in the summer of 1998, I got a call from Scott Kalbrenner from the Air Combat Command Treaty Office. He told me that the silo elimination was progressing at Grand Forks, and if we didn't see some legislative action soon, Delta 9 would have to be added to the demolition contract. A few days later, I was surprised by an email from South Dakota Senator Tom Johnson's office stating that the legislation had been submitted and that a hearing was scheduled for 10 days later, and that I would be receiving a request to testify on behalf of the bill. I immediately informed my chain of command. I can only imagine the consternation and communication at multiple levels up to the Pentagon about an Air Force base level engineer being asked to testify before a congressional committee. But after receiving the guidelines for the senator's office, I got busy writing. Another few days later, I found myself in Washington, D.C., being prepped by the Air Force legislative liaison, a Lieutenant Colonel Underwood, if I recall. I remember saying something like, "She must have felt a little like Henry Higgins in the musical My Fair Lady, trying to transform a working class girl into someone who could be passed off as a cultured member of society." I'm not sure if she thought that was funny. Due to the very short suspense, my testimony did not get the normal reviews. But she did have a couple of issues with it. She asked me to remove the statement about wondering if we would see the fireballs of Soviet nuclear bombs detonating over western South Dakota. And the second one where I said, I imagined there was a big red bullseye over western South Dakota on the Soviet war planners map. I asked her politely, I think, whose testimony was it? After a brief conversation, she agreed that I could keep the statement since it was my personal memory. But I agreed to remove the second statement because, in return, I got the Air Force blessing of my testimony. The Senate committee hearing was held in a relatively small room. I was preceded by a National Park Service Associate Director. Near the end of her testimony, she stated that the departments were working to resolve a number of issues, the first being that the site contained hazardous materials. It sounded like it could be a deal breaker to me. I turned to Senator Johnson's aide and told her the statement was false and asked what we do. Do we stand up and object? And she told me, no, just be quiet and wait. Sometime later, she left the room. When my turn came, I presented my carefully prepared testimony, closing with the following. This is an unprecedented window of opportunity to preserve for the American public the ability to view and contemplate this significant period of U.S. history, the secret underground world of the nuclear missile, silently poised beneath the peaceful prairies of the Great Plains. But it is a story bigger than that of missile sites. It is the story of the Cold War and how it affected our lives. It is the story of the Air Force's role in the defense of our nation. It is the story of the people of South Dakota and other states who lived alongside military installations. It is the story of a local rancher who tells of working through the bitter winter, helping mine the 80-foot deep holes that would become the missile silos, of a missile maintenance team battling a first winter blizzard to bring a missile site back on alert, of a rancher who helped out an Air Force alert crew stranded on the gravel back road of the missile field, or of the elderly lady who owned the land surrounding the missile site and told us we wouldn't have to blow up her missile site. She wouldn't tell anybody, since we might need it again someday. True story. It is a story that needs to be told. And then I got to end with, the Air Force strongly supports the establishment of the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. After finishing my testimony, Senator Craig Thomas from Wyoming asked why it was an Ellsworth missile site that was being preserved and not one from Wyoming. And I answered quite simply, your sites are still on alert. Then at some point, Senator Johnson entered the room. After addressing the committee chairman, he called me back to testify. Just like on a television lawyer show, he asked me leading questions that allowed me to elaborate on the environmental sampling and cleanup conducted by the Air Force and emphasize that we had written concurrence from the South Dakota Department of Environment and Natural Resources that everything had been done that was necessary to protect human health and the environment. I was impressed. A non-confrontational, clean and concise correction to the record. It couldn't have been scripted any better. The bill was signed the following year by President Clinton on November 29th, 1999. Armed with the freshly signed Minuteman Missile National Historic Site Establishment Act, I called Scott Kalbrenner at ACC back and said I was ready for the missile that he said was waiting to be placed at Delta 9. A short while later, he informed me that a designated Delta 9 missile did not exist. So the search began. One of the questions asked was, where is the funding? All I could say was, I don't have the money, just the legislation. During one conference call discussing acquisition of a missile, a representative from Hill Air Force Base, which was a depot for the Minuteman missiles, said that they had 2 suitable missiles, but that his colonel had already identified locations for them. The representative from the Museum of the Air Force immediately replied, my Major General says that those are his missiles, and the first one is going to the Museum of the Air Force missile display, and the second one is going to Delta 9. End of conversation. The amazing part of the story is how organizations across the Air Force missile community stepped up and responded without hesitation with the same professionalism that they performed their daily mission. I remember a phone call with Hill Air Force Base Depot where the newly designated Delta 9 missile was stored. They asked if I would like to have the training model missile painted to closer match the colors of an operational missile. Of course, I said yes. Although there were many involved in that process, the hero, from my perspective, was Pat Patterson, a treaty guy at Hill Air Force Base that put all the pieces together. He arranged for Kirtland Air Force Base to prepare and ship a demilitarized guidance set, a lightweight spacer, and the reentry vehicle aeroshell, really the outside of the nuclear weapon, at no more than a request letter signed by me. When Hill Air Force Base asked how I was going to get the missile to Ellsworth, I asked them if they could just put it on a missile transporter, like they usually do, and bring it here. Surprisingly, they said yes. We'll call it a training mission. Now that we had a missile, but needed a way to get it in the hole, F.E. Warren was the nearest Air Force base. So I blindly called up who used to be called the Deputy Commander for Maintenance, a Colonel Robert Mansfield, explained my predicament, and asked if he would be willing to emplace a missile at Delta 9. Without hesitation, he said yes. It all came together on the week of July 11 through 16, 2001, when a missile transporter from Hill Air Force Base and a transporter erector from F.E. Warren met at a hangar on Ellsworth Air Force Base flight line. When the roll transfer of the missile from one vehicle to the other was complete, the Hill Air Force driver asked me to sign a receipt for the delivery of a missile. I'm not sure of anybody else who owns one. The next day, we emplaced it at Delta 9. Here's a picture of the TE with the Minuteman logo on the front. The TE is backed up to the launcher, and the support mic bands are parked to the side. We see the back of the missile covered with the nozzles covered and with the decorative patches installed. The TE starts to erect and is then ready to go. We take a peek down the missile silo and see the support ring on which the missile was set. The missile starts to lower. And here we see it from 20 feet down the launch tube in the diving board. Here it approaches its resting place. It is suspended by 18-part cables. I was told there's 5 feet short of a mile of cable on that transporter erector. Then the maintenance teams from F.E. Warren assembled the RV Aeroshell lightweight spacer to the guidance set for placement on top of the missile. When it was done, it looked like this, almost like a real missile on alert. The highlight for me was descending 65 feet down the silo in the work cage with a missile technician and disconnecting the sling rods that had lowered the missile into position. It was an emotional time back at the hangar that afternoon during the informal ceremony recognizing what had just been done. A small plaque had been placed in the silo with the names of the 90th Missile Wing Team with the inscription stating, "This silo was configured by the men and women of the 90th Logistic Group, F.E. Warren Air Force Base, Wyoming, as a lasting tribute to the Minuteman II weapon system and all the warriors who maintained and operated it. It is standing proof that the Cold War did not just end, it was won. 8,760 days on constant alert. Rest easy, old friend. Your targets are covered." Sometime earlier, I traveled to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. to present the Delta IX static display conversion plans to the Compliance Review Group. Now with their approval and the missile in place, we were ready to start construction. The launcher closure door would be opened 1 foot past halfway and then permanently welded and grouted in place. A concrete and glass viewing enclosure would be constructed over the silo opening. Construction began when the Start Office issued a Format 55, which was a notice of intent to place an item on static display to the Russians. A barrier set was placed around the launcher closure, and then it was opened as a concrete or a wooden platform was built over what would be the open hole for safety purposes. The launcher closure was moved into its permanent position where it was welded and grouted in place. The viewing enclosure concrete wall was formed and poured. You can see on the left where it extends 2 feet over the top of the silo so that people can peer directly down inside of it. Then they began to build the aluminum frame for the glass. When it was nearly done, we had to sneak down and see what it looked like. My friend Sarah Hutchison came up from Denver to see our project as it neared completion. This is what it looked like when done. The launcher closure door partly open on the rails. It would have traveled had there been a launch. And here it is looking from a light pole northeast of the launcher. So with the construction complete, the Start Office issued a Format 65, a notice of completion of procedures associated with placing an item on static display to the Russians, which started the conversion inspection period. On May 21st, 2002, a contingent of U.S. and Russian START inspectors traveled out to Delta 9 to conduct the formal conversion inspection. When the inspection was done, they asked for a group photograph. And we also took one of me along with the two inspection team leaders. At the signing ceremony conducted at the Officers Club in Ellsworth, there was a customary exchange of gifts. I presented each of the Russian inspectors with a 6-inch piece of Delta 9 hardened inner sight cable, stating through an interpreter that this was a piece of the communication cable through which the command that would have meant the end of the world as we know it would have been transmitted. After the inspection, the START office issued a Format 3, notification of change of data in the MOU. The Delta 9 was now officially a static display in accordance with START. On September 27, 2002, exactly 11 years to the day from the stand down of Minuteman II, the Air Force officially turned Minuteman Missile National Historic Site over to the National Park Service at a ceremony at Delta 9. The festivities included a B-1 flyover, presentation of the colors by the Base Honor Guard, and a performance by the Rapid City Central High School Marching Band. The event was attended by civilian and military alike. Dignitaries included, from left to right, Fran Manella, Director of the Park Service, Craig Manson, Assistant Secretary of Fish and Wildlife and Parks, Department of Interior, and the former Missileer, Colonel James Kowalski, Commander of Ellsworth Air Force Base's 28th Bomb Wing, Lieutenant General Robert Hinson, Vice Commander of Air Force Base Command, Bill Supernaw, Superintendent of Badlands National Park, and Ronald Orr, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. Craig Manson spoke of his memories as an officer of the 44th Missile Wing at Ellsworth, stating that the preservation of Delta 1 and Delta 9 is a most fitting idea because, for this reason, the Cold War dominated the last half of the 20th century, and some will, believe it this or not, but most of American life, in one way or another, was defined by the Cold War. Colonel Kowalski then transferred the Delta 1 key to Bill Supernaw. An interesting note about the key. The key and lock used at the main gate to each LCF was manufactured by Folger Adams. It was large, about 4 inches long, and made of brass. I recognize it as the same key that we had used in the construction of a prison-like detention facility back in the 1970s. A lot has happened since that day. The Minuteman National Historic Site is fully operational and consists of 3 separate facilities. Delta 9, located at exit 116, is 3/4 miles south of the interstate and is open daily for self-guided tours. Delta 1, located at exit 127, is open for tours by appointment. And the Visitor Center is open at exit 131, where you turn to go to the Badlands, and is open 6 days a week. Oh. And throughout these 25 years, a lot is, and I just want to say that throughout these last 25 years, one thing that stands out is the commitment of both the Air Force and the National Park Service people involved with the site. So today, this National Historic Site and the Visitor Center provide the American public, and quite literally, visitors from around the world, the unprecedented opportunity to view and contemplate the significant period of U.S. history and the secret underground world of the nuclear missile, silently poised beneath the peaceful prairies of the Great Plains. And I have to close with this picture here. My memories of being out in the missile field are very good ones. Some of the best are in the springtime when you hear the meadowlarks chirping, and then as you're walking, they run away, seemingly to lead you away from a nest somewhere. But then I also remember the wintertime where the snow drifts and blows over the site. And to me, this is a reminder of all those Air Force personnel who have and you continue to support our Minuteman system. A few weeks prior to the nomination or the inauguration of the Visitor Center, while visiting with Eric Leonard, a previous superintendent for Minuteman, it appeared to me, he proclaimed with excitement he could hardly contain, something very close to, this site is a testimony not only to the historic role of the Minuteman missile in winning the Cold War, but to those men and women who continue to make history, maintaining and operating the Air Force ICBM nuclear deterrent force. So I would like to express my gratitude to all those who have served and those who serve today to preserve the freedoms we enjoy. Thank you.
I'm wondering, how are we protected now? Now, being for the Minuteman, those missiles are not there.
How are we protecting now?
How are we protecting our nation?
If I remember my figures correctly, when all the Minutemen were on alert, there was something like 2,400 warheads. And the START Treaty ended up reducing those. Today, I believe there's 450 remaining. F.E. Warren, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, and Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota still have operational missiles. And the Air Force is in the process of developing a new generation missile called the Sentinel, which I don't know much about. But it will continue on in the tradition of Minuteman as one part of our nuclear triad.
Not really a question. I'm Val Simpson from Rapid City, and my grandparents ranched kind of south of Wall, and on the road to get to the ranch was one of the missiles. So I was just going to say, if you haven't had the opportunity to take this tour, you definitely want to get it on your list. It's really interesting. It's very worth it. One of my favorite pictures is my kids in front of that Domino's sign of the Domino's delivery. So just a plug for this experience. It's really cool.
When you get old, you know a lot of things and a lot of people. And all of it comes to mind when you said that the Russians could fly over with the satellite and see the decommissioning taking place. Sparked a memory that in Tucson, Arizona, there's an Air and Space Museum south of town. You could go and walk amongst all kinds of aircraft. They used to have a decommissioned missile laying on the side, and the people wouldn't sign the treaty till they got rid of that decommissioned missile because they could see it from space and they weren't absolutely sure that it wasn't active. But it's worth a visit if you get down in that area.
Actually, when Sarah and I went down to, I think it was when we went down to Green Valley to look at that Titan site, to use as sort of an example for our planning, we drove by what is called a boneyard. And we stopped on the road and actually saw B-52s there, and with a crane dropping a big guillotine and chopping the wings off the B-52.
Hi, I'm Dee Berry, and I really don't have a question, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate what Tim had said. We are open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 8 to 4. We have a retired missileer, Ranger Jim Bench, who actually is there and gives tours of the site. Tours themselves of the Delta One site are really limited. We only have elevator large enough for 6 people, and those do book out 90 days in advance. But we have through Black Hills Central Reservations, there are reservations that you can call. And I did give Kevin a few of our brochures and a little bit of the information about them, how you can get tours of our site. So he will have those available out at the front, so if anybody's interested. And I just want to thank Kevin and thank Tim for this opportunity to showcase our site that we're so very proud of, and we hope you can all come visit us. Thank you.